Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's online talk from the Contemporary Art Society for Wales. I'm Roland Davis, Vice Chair of CASW, and I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's speaker, Dawn Woolley. Good evening, Dawn.
Hello.
Now, Dawn was originally to give this talk in person at our regular lecture venue at Cardiff University, but COVID intervened, and we're extremely grateful to Dawn for agreeing to switch to this online presence. Dawn is a visual artist using photography, video, installation, performance, and sound. She's also a research fellow at Leeds Arts University and an honorary research fellow at Coventry University. Her exhibitions and performances are too numerous to number, and she's equally prolific as a writer. I'm pleased to say that Dawn will be exhibiting at the University of South Wales from 1 November as part of the Imagining History show, so you'll get a chance to see the work in person. Dawn has agreed to take questions at the end of her talk for those joining us on Zoom. We would like you to put your name and question into the chat box. And when we get to the point for questions, then I'll explain to you how this is going to work. So at this point, Dawn, it's over to you.
Great. So let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yep.
Great. I will have to do a slight rejig thing partway through just to show a different screen, but hopefully that will go without a hitch. So thank you for having me here to speak, and I'm slightly sad that it's not in person, as I always look forward to my trips to Cardiff, but online is certainly better than nothing, and hopefully it means we have a slightly more geographically disparate audience than we would have had. But anyway, so I'm going to talk to you today about quite a broad range of work that I've produced over the past 15 years, I would say. But I'll start by saying that my research examines the relationship between people and objects and the impacts that adverts have as producers and disseminators of social values. The artwork that I make blurs the boundary between self-portraiture and still life, producing inanimate bodies and animate objects. I'm interested in how social ideals are transmitted through commercial visual culture. And by interpreting commodities and adverts, I think about the ideologies that they support and try to understand how they shape the identity of the consumer. My central argument is that commodity culture turns everything into adverts, including selfies. And I consider social networking sites to be the commercial space where commodity culture invades our social interactions. And because I'm interested in advertising, photography is as much a subject, the subject of my artwork as it is the medium that I use. And I produce site-specific work for commercial advertising spaces on billboards and on social networking sites. And so this work is from a series called The Substitute. And this series and subsequent series examine the act of looking and being looked at and reflect on my experience of becoming an object of sight. I'm interested in the power relations of exhibitionism and voyeurism. And I use the visual style of adverts because I want to think about how adverts shape the relationship that we have to our own bodies and the bodies of others. And I also like to play with ideas of three-dimensionality and flatness. So I'm particularly interested in how photographs represent things, the illusions and fictions that you can create with photographs, because we inherently trust them as a form of truth. When we look at photographs, we often assume that they are objective, which makes them very persuasive and potentially quite manipulative. I'm fascinated by the fact that we look at two-dimensional pieces of paper, but see bodies, landscapes, buildings, and so on, three-dimensional things. And the Substitute series plays with this misrecognition. And these are some sculptural kind of experiments that I did coming out of the Substitute series. And at the time that I was making these, I was really thinking about something that Roland Barthes says in Camera Lucida, where he describes his experience of posing for a photograph and says, I already make another body for myself. I turn myself in advance into an image. Photographs always transform. They never merely show something as it is. We forget that we are looking at a two-dimensional image and see real breathing bodies instead. We also potentially forget the level of construction and manipulation that takes place. And when images are manipulated and we don't think about it, they create unattainable standards for bodies. Meredith Jones, a writer and researcher in fashion, talks about this in an article about fashionable faces. She explains that we no longer aspire to look like a real person. Because most of the images of people that we experience are professionally lit, made up, airbrushed, and retouched, we no longer attempt to emulate real bodies, but instead try and turn ourselves into images. And I think the kind of recent trend of cosmetic products that claim to airbrush, blur, and erase imperfections on the skin show that we're looking for a Photoshop in real life, that we want to become images. And so in this earlier work, I literally become an image, edited, idealized, and frozen. This version of me is better than the real me in many ways, but ultimately she's disappointing. It looks like she's taking part in I've written a tongue twister for myself, which is not very helpful. It looks like she is taking part in an embrace, but she will always fail to satisfy. She is my metaphor for the lure of the image in magazines and adverts. And as this work progressed, I became increasingly interested in the experience of the viewer looking at and being tricked by a photograph. So this series is called Interloper. And rather than depicting an encounter between a man and a woman who's cut out, I attempt to create a direct relationship between the cutout and the spectator. I aim to prolong the suspension of disbelief, so the disjuncture between presence and absence of the body is more pronounced. Now, this is where I need to escape and hopefully bring you with me as I flip to a different screen, which inevitably, hang on, I'll just stop sharing for a moment and see if I can share again. Oh, perfect. So, oh, I played it from the end. Okay, and that the soundtrack there was by Leroy Carr, if anyone is interested, and that was Interloper. a short video that kind of summarized the things that I was thinking about in the Interloper photographic series. And again, very much playing with that idea of the 2D and the 3D and the trickery of photography. And this work kind of progressed into a series called Visual Pleasure, in which I examined the artificiality of femininity. In these photographs, the female character is not a cutout, but she is a construction because she's an idealized woman that renders her artificial. So during these shoots, I arranged myself on the stage with cutout furniture and attempt to hold them in place. And this is the first time I actually put myself in front of the lens rather than sort of in a displaced way as a cutout. And so while my assistant was taking these photographs for me, I struggled to maintain the position that I'd allocated myself, that of object of desire. So on first reading of these images, they appear to fall neatly into a patriarchal sexual language that Laura Mulvey describes in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema as a construction of sexuality that reduces the female subject into a two-dimensional representation. She is, in Mulvey's words, cut to the measure of desire. But in these images, the woman is isolated in a world of her own making. She has created a fantasy body in order to appeal to the male gaze, and she is captive in the panopticon that she had built up around herself. And so when I was making these works, because I was kind of doing it on a fairly sort of thrown together ad hoc set with cutouts of furniture that were basically just prints, photographic prints stuck on bits of MDF, they started to fall apart under the heat of the light as the photographs were being taken. So I was kind of in this strange performative space of trying to hold the poses as they needed to be held, but also hold up the set around me. And the kind of struggle of that and the genuine pain of the experience kind of fed in to future work. And particularly this series of performances called Cut to the Measure of Desire, which, as I said previously, comes from Laura Mulvey. And in this work, I kind of expand that idea of the two-dimensional set by creating these big kind of tableau vivant scenes in which everything but me is a two-dimensional photograph. And yeah, so I would pose within them as a tableau vivant, trying to hold the image together in a way. But the longer I try and hold the pose, the harder it is to keep the illusion going. And so these were my first ever live performance. And they were commissioned by Studio Safla, which was a kind of public art offshoot of the Arts Council of Wales some time ago, in order to develop my visual pleasure work into live performances. And the stage is actually the Con Club, I think Roath Park Con Club stage. So I don't know, well, I'm not sure exactly why I picked that, but I think it's a slightly wry joke for myself, really. But yeah, so that all happened in the upstairs function room there. And I also did some performances of this series in the studio for the Lens. And I should say that this is also the first time that I started to work with the symbolism of Dutch still life and genre paintings. So all of the objects that are chosen to be photographic cutouts have some sort of symbolic value within those paintings. And actually also these studio performances nod to those Dutch symbols because they're titled, what are they titled? I've lost my place. Vogelen, Melken and Neyen, which are Dutch words that have faint kind of sexual undertones if you are a 17th century audience. Okay, so I'll just take you through those. And And in this work, I take the play with the illusion of space in the photographic plane to a kind of conclusion. So if in the substitute series, I turn the body in advance into an image, in this series, I stretch the photograph out around myself and create a kind of disintegrated three-dimensional photograph. And so this is a performance that was titled Foolish Passion, and that was commissioned by G39 to take place in an exhibition in the Spinnerei in Leipzig some years ago. Okay, so I'll also show you a couple more iterations of this series, and particularly a sort of mini series within that I did called Homer Bula, Life is a Bubble, which is a phrase common in Vanitas paintings and used to evoke the idea that pleasure is fleeting, life is short, but the consequences of our actions will play out long in the afterlife. So yes, this is a performance in what was G39's home when it was in the centre of Cardiff some years ago. And the installation was a kind of like a still life arrangement of meat that you might find in a Dutch genre painting of a butcher's scene, in which the kind of abundance of types of meat cascade towards the viewer. But in this case, with the addition of me in some of my props of femininity borrowed from the Visual Pleasure series, and also a big knife and a skinned rabbit. So the rabbit seemed quite popular and drew quite a crowd. And then, so this, a kind of another iteration of the Homer Bula performance was this one, which was kind of more of an abattoir setup. And I did get permission to photograph in an abattoir near Bridgend some years ago. And so this is in Block Gallery in Sheffield, but it was also performed in the Association of Photography in Vilnius. So yes, in this iteration of the performance, I used an ox's tongue and an ox's heart rather than a rabbit. And partly because instead of drawing on Dutch symbolism, I wanted to think about the relationship of bodies, and particularly female bodies, to meat. So there's kind of like, I was aware that I was presenting myself within these setups of meat as another form of meat or flesh. And so when we talk about losing one's tongue or heart, we might be trying to suggest that we are either in love or heartbroken. And we also talk about cutting off someone's tongue or them being heartless. So these pieces of flesh are already very loaded symbols, and they are much more legible to contemporary audiences than some of the symbolism of Dutch paintings. Okay, there's the heart. And then the final version that I'm going to show you of that is an installation of the photographs without me. Basically, the photographs perform alone, if you like. And this is in All Coherence Gone, a still life exhibition of contemporary artists that engage with Dutch still life that was curated by Francis Woodley at Bay Arts some years ago. And in this installation, the abattoir photographs play with a 2D, 3D thing more than in other installations, because they give a full sense of depth. And as you can see in this installation image, it's not a very large set for the installation. It lacks the depth that the photographs claim to possess. And these performances were the last in a series of work in which I appear. And the photographic installations marked my move from self-portraiture to a complete preoccupation with objects. So, yeah, there became a point in my career some years ago where I felt that I'd got to a real difficult point in my practice. It was a time when advertising had got quite derogatory and sexualized, I think particularly fashion advertising. And there were photographers like Terry Richardson producing American apparel ad campaigns that were so explicitly objectifying that they seemed to be excused as a form of parody, maybe what Judith Williamson calls sexism with an alibi, in which they're so outrageously sexist, they must be a joke. And at this point, I felt that the body had become quite difficult to present and kind of remain or keep a grip of the context of them. So it might be, and also it was a time when social media was a thing and images were being shared online. So yeah, keeping a control of the signification of my work seemed to be a little difficult. And actually there's an experience I had where I came across some of my substitute photographs on a Chinese blog. And I'd got someone to loosely translate it for me just out of interest to see what they were saying about my work. And the person who wrote the blog had assumed that I was a male photographer and had basically described the photographs as something like, this photographer has created images of his ideal girlfriend who is perfect because she's made of paper and she can't speak back, which was definitely not my intentions when I produced substitute series. So I had a little crisis of confidence at that point, and thought about how can I continue to make the work that I'm making without inviting what is quite a sexist interpretation. So Still Life offered me the lifeline that I needed. As I said, I was already interested in the symbolism of Dutch still lifes. I'm particularly fascinated by the way that Dutch paintings described a person through objects. So in the paintings like this one, which is Still Life with Drinking Horn by Willem Calf, which is often or usually on display at the National Gallery. So yeah, in the paintings, the objects can be interpreted on an allegorical level with symbolic meanings relating to morals, religion, and temptation. And so, for example, in this painting, the lemon could be interpreted as a warning against the pleasures of the flesh and life that is, or pleasures that are not so sweet within. And black pepper is often presented because it's both expensive and exotic in those days, and served as a warning about inflamed passions and also the dangers of straying too far from home. So the objects on the still life table refer to a specific type of consumer, and the individual who it is implied is going to eat the food. Sorry, that didn't make sense. But yeah, so the objects that he's going to eat and the utensils he says that he uses say something about his social position. So in this case, he's wealthy because he has very expensive objects, and also some sort of global trade link because of the kind of geographical range of stuff on the table. And so moving to still life meant for me that I could present objects with specific moral connotations and talk about sexualization and objectification without having to actually show the body. And it meant this content of the image could be removed from the surface, but not completely lost. And actually, when I was doing my PhD research into Dutch still life paintings, I also came increasingly to view them as a kind of precursor to advertising, because they do showcase all of these very opulent, expensive objects and like actual real objects. So the Saint Sebastian Archers Guild drinking horn, which is prominent in this image, is still in possession of the Amsterdam Museum, for example. And actually in The Art of Describing, Svetlana Alpers talked about, you know, if you want to see beautiful Dutch tiles, you look at them in a painting by Vermeer. And she said that not only did the painters depict these commodities, they also increasingly became purveyors of them. So their paintings kind of functioned as adverts for their sideline in their commodity sales. So, and like in contemporary advertising, we do see still lives a lot. That's probably the most common place that we will see still life imagery. And they still suggest unseen consumers who have character traits based on the commodities that they consume. And in advertising, food particularly tends to fall into two categories: those that tell you to indulge yourself and those that tell you to be careful what you eat. And Robert Crawford, a political economy theorist who writes about ideas of health in consumer societies, says that capitalism has two contradictory demands: that we must have a work ethic in order to be productive, and a consumer ethic to use up what we produce. So we're told to delay gratification and instantly gratify ourselves simultaneously. And at the level of the body and consumption of food, this plays havoc. And so the Celebrate series that you can see now and the previous image attempts to say something about this contradiction. Are tried to create objects that would problematize the idea of food as a healthy fuel or a naughty indulgence, and therefore to represent consumers who struggle to deal with this contradiction. And at this stage of my research, I spent some time talking to eating disorder specialists and visited some outpatient clinics to talk to recovering eating disorder sufferers. And I gained a greater understanding of how food is symbolized within an eating disorder, and use these ideas to create this work. And so in this image, these images came directly from that research. So on the left, you can see objects that are all made of porcelain. They are cast and molded from real crisps and sweets, so they look very realistic, but they are drained of color. And although the porcelain is delicate and valuable, the objects are also useless because they are inedible. And on the right, the objects are made from concrete, less delicate and valuable, but equally inedible. And the grey matte material sucks the joy out of the party spread that we see. So I continue to think about the contradiction of indulgence and self-restraint in this series, which is called Lure. And actually, I'm showing it as a grid here, but I never show it in that way. If I exhibit the work, they're always in a long line. So I don't know why I don't really replicate that with these, but never mind. So in this series, I use sweets, cakes, and fishing paraphernalia to make a connection between advertising, artificiality, and duped prey. In this series, I further blur the line between still life and portraiture by placing the objects on a vertical plane, like a shop window display, and not on the horizontal plane of the still life table. So yeah, there's some examples there. And I was really interested in the kind of language of diet products as well. I will speak a little bit more about that later on. And so the next series that I produced is called Pacifier, and it takes the blending of portrait and still life a little bit further, in that bodies are more sort of visually represented by the objects, and also because the vignettes could be read in terms of portraiture, or more disturbingly as the beheaded trophies of a hunter. And in this series, I was considering the process of sexualization in consumer culture using sweets, sex toys, and nail art practice dummies. And in my writing, I was arguing that sexualized commodities transform the consumer from a living, breathing body into an erotic spectacle, a surface appeal without substance. And I was using, as I said, sex toys and nail art practice dummies in the place of people, in order to demonstrate how the decorative and sexual characteristics come to overpower other aspects of the body through its commodification. The commodity body is fragmented into erotic signs and transforms those who covet it into passive, distracted consumers. And this is an idea that I do expand on greatly in the book that I will also talk about a little bit later on. Okay, so here's an installation image of the Pacifier series, and some of you may recognise that as the upstairs space of Turner House, when it was the home of Photo Gallery. And lost my place, sorry, okay. And you can also within this image see the Memorial Series and Nature Mort on the floor. And with Pacifier, these 3 series are kind of intended to track the evolution of the consumer's body in capitalism. So if Pacifier denotes the idealized, sexualized young female body, in Memorials, it is hitting middle age and starting to sag. And then ultimately ends here as a quite depressing nature mort. And if you can't recognize that, it is old moldy mints with flies crawling around on it that I did leave to develop, should we say, in my garden for a number of weeks before doing that shoot. And I was absolutely harassed by flies when I took the photos. But that's probably, you've seen enough of that one, so I won't linger there. And yeah, as I said kind of at the beginning, that photography is as much the subject as the medium because I'm interested in advertising. And particularly, I'm interested in challenging the prevalent messages that are found in adverts by intervening in that realm. So I applied for a grant from the Arts Council of Wales to buy commercial advertising space and fill it with my work. So the idea was to create a space in the visual landscape so that that is otherwise dominated by commerce. So this poster, which has 5 of the Pacifier vignettes, is also accompanied by a quote from Brave New World by Aldous Huxley that reads, "The decanted infant howls. At once a nurse appears with a bottle of external secretion. Feeling lurks in that interval of time between desire and its consummation. Shorten that interval, ... And this poster was displayed in Cardiff just before Christmas 2014. And by including the quote, I wanted to emphasize the idea of distraction and pacification through consumption, something that is ramped up at Christmas time and when we're encouraged to spend as much money as we can and worry about the consequences later. And so I'll quickly show you the other posters that were produced for that advertising campaign. So these are some images from Scales, which are also part of the Celebrate series that I began the still life section with. And they were kind of made particularly for these posters and consider the social stigma and medicalization attached to fat. So as I said, the photographs are produced for posters and with the intention of displaying them in Cardiff in January 2015. So the month after the Pacifier photograph. And so there's a couple more of those. And I wanted to draw attention to the way that adverts abruptly change in that period between Christmas or after Christmas and after New Year. So then, it goes from being indulge yourself and have a good time to what have you done, time to start the diet kind of thing. So they were produced to be displayed in Cardiff in January. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. And then the final poster in that series is called Wonderland. And it kind of examines diet products. As I mentioned earlier with Lure, I became very interested in what they are and what they actually mean about us as a consumer society. So the poster uses the Eat Me and Drink Me labels to evoke Alice in Wonderland and the magical food and drink that made her shrink very small and grow very large. There's an added contradiction in this work, as there is a vast array of products designed to reduce the body and implying that we can eat to excess and still diminish, and a solitary item that claims to bulk up the body. The less we consume, the more we grow, and vice versa. And I think the diet industry exemplifies the contradiction of capitalist society because it promotes products that seem to permit both imperatives, delay gratification and seek reward. The fact that the products are generally chocolate bars, crisps, and milkshakes infers that they are both the temptation and the solution. And they also encourage increased consumption by frustrating desire with smaller portion sizes, but not fully fulfilling it. And so they are ideal commodities for capitalist society. And as Richard Klein writes, more diet means more appetite, and more appetite means more consumption. And so I'm going to hold off on some images for a while, because as my research into advertise developed, I started to look at social networking sites as an advertising domain. And this led to an ongoing series of site-specific artworks made specifically for social media. But before I show that work, I'll share some of that research about advertising celebrity culture and selfies. So celebrity selfies are adverts for lifestyle and body ideals, as well as the commodities the celebrities are paid to endorse. In turn, all selfies function as adverts for the social ideals and commodities they present. In selfies, the personal and commercial coalesce. Users of social networking sites are the commodity. Our attention is sold to marketing companies, and the information we generate with each interaction produces vast amounts of data that places in specific marketing demographics based on what we like and who we are connected to. And Thomas Davenport and John Beck foresaw this, the economic value of attention, in their book, The Attention Economy, that was published in 2001. They say that the scientific and social advancements produced increasing amounts of knowledge and new technology that disseminates a vast amount of information quickly and widely, so that we've become increasingly overloaded with information. They cite the economist Herbert Simon, who says, "What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." The issue of consumer attention is important to advertisers because people are particularly good at averting their eyes from adverts. We have what they call an inbuilt attention protection feature that preserves attention for more important or interesting things. In a world characterized by an excess of information, advertisers have to look for ways to capture attention and prevent viewers from screening the adverts out. So Davenport and Beck identify a number of techniques for doing so. They say that content should be expressed as a lifelike, realistic story to which the consumer can relate. The method of delivery should be interactive rather than passive, because consumers invest more attention if they contribute to the content in some way. And advertisers should also use cross-promotion, promoting commodities using things or people that already get a lot of attention, because once held, consumer attention can be easily carried from one product to another. And social networking sites, it turns out, are prime sites for attention economy advertising. They foreground user popularity through the prominent display of numbers of followers and interactions, making it clear which users are attention rich and would make effective cross-promoters. They capitalize on our need for community inclusion and desire for prestige that can be gained from association with prominent social members, such as celebrities. And because followers can like, share, and comment upon the posts they see, they may feel that they are co-creating content and invest their attention to a greater degree. And a community of loyal fans is transformed into a community of potential consumers when a celebrity speaks positively about a product. And this has been shown in research. So, for example, Jennifer Annette Lewick carried out content analysis of Kim Kardashian's Facebook posts in April and May 2011 to determine if they were more effective, basically, than other types of promotion. And she found that Kardashian frequently embedded product endorsements into personal stories and gained most audience responses when her posts were posed as questions directed to the audience, because these posts allowed fans to respond and feel like not only were they co-creating, but also in a conversation with the celebrity. And celebrity endorsements are more effective when they are lifelike, when the post resembles spontaneous glimpses of the celebrity's private life and the commercial content is less obvious to the audience. And fans willingly give their attention to product endorsements, enabling advertisers to overcome their attention protection feature. Okay. And kind of the reason I'm telling you this is because there becomes a kind of homogenization of aesthetic styles and lifestyles basically on social media, because the social media users emulate their celebrity idols and kind of use the same signs of success, the objects that surround them, to kind of speak about the type of people they are. So in some ways, these selfies are a little bit like the Dutch genre paintings that I mentioned much earlier, in which the characters will be surrounded by objects that have these allegorical moral values that are then attached to the individual in the painting. But in the case of selfies and celebrity selfies, they tend to be signs of conspicuous consumption and luxury lifestyle. Okay, so that's enough of the dull theory bit. I'll get back to showing you some actual images. So while I was doing this research and thinking about these kind of the transmission of these values and the types of aesthetic styles that were being produced on social media, I made this series of still lives, which were called Hysterical Selfies. And the title comes from the kind of viewing, or no, the position from which they're photographed. So it's a standing position featuring a mirror, which conforms to the framing of mirror selfies, but they do not reflect an individual posing with a camera, instead reveal more commodities. I wanted to describe how the values of commodities accumulate, much like those signs of conspicuous consumption accumulate on social media. So I carefully chose products that all have similar ideological messages that reinforce stereotypes. So, for example, female products are often food related, but there is always a warning for external use only. They tell the female consumer, you can consume, just don't eat. These products are all about the production of a surface in order to be consumed by someone else. The stereotypical male consumer, however, is allowed to eat. He needs fuel so that he can be powerful, dominating, and fierce. Even the products that were traditionally viewed as feminine are given hypermasculine messages with names like rhino skin, man cave, and pure volcano. Stereotypes are reinforced because men are equated with power, while women are deemed to be very surface-based, artificial, and superficial. I wanted to expose how the names and labels attached to products subtly and insidiously reinforce stereotypes and regulate acceptable gendered behaviours. And to kind of reinforce the idea of how identities are increasingly shaped by commercial culture. And I think particularly because of the advent of social media, in which advertising and selfies and personal posts are all just absolutely integrated into a continuous stream of information. But yeah, so I had these images printed as pop-up display banners. So they, kind of something that you'd normally find at a checkout or in a trade show, showing off new products. So yeah, they kind of reinforce the idea of commercially built. Okay, and when I was making the Hysterical Selfies series, I wanted to go into more depth about the the kind of ideological values and the meanings of some of these commodities. So this is why I started to work site specifically on social media and on Instagram in particular. So I chose to present the work online, also in order to intervene on social networking sites as commercial domains in the same way that I had with billboard posters earlier in my research. So I created a series, the series for Instagram, and called it Wishbook. The title derives from 19th century commodity catalogues from the early days of mail order, department stores, and mass-produced commodities. The catalogues were called things like the Great Wishbook and the American Dream Book. They sold the American way of life and helped to homogenize other cultures to the American ideal. And the images, as you can probably tell, are scanned rather than photographed. And I wanted to kind of recreate some of the classic conventions of advertising. So, for example, an object against a white kind of expanse. But I didn't want to make adverts for these products. So I decided the compromise would just be to make crap adverts. So, so using a scanner meant I could produce quite degraded images that don't show off the commodities, but maybe undermine their desirableness. And actually, I often showed half-eaten stuff and empty packets, so they're very much more like rubbish than a glossy advertising image. And although the work is mainly about stereotypes of gender, race, and age that are perpetuated through the commodification of the body, it also explores the potential, the disruptive potential of objects. So the title alludes to Walter Benjamin's idea that consumers can appropriate commodities as emancipatory wish images. And he says that because the social or commercial value of an object is arbitrary, it can be changed. He says that we can inhabit them and make them act abnormally. So by making these crap adverts, I hope that they inhabit Instagram feeds and act abnormally. And I should say, I use hashtags that are either already associated with the products or that I've made up to kind of form a sort of feminist critique. And they do kind of read as the ramblings of a mad woman. So, yeah. Okay, and I will come back a little bit to talk a little bit more about using social media, but I'll just quickly run through a couple more series of work that I made since completing my PhD. So this is Relics, which is usually shown in a grid, so this is absolutely fine. And it's produced from all of the stereotypical branding packaging that I had sort of bought and used in the previous two series. But as I'd collected all this stuff and then had to get rid of it when I'd finished the work, I was kind of struck by the environmental impact of my consumption and of the kind of packaging in general. So I decided to make work that specifically talks about that issue. And the relics were kind of also designed as sort of the dark foreboding counterpoint to the bright glossy Lure series. And they're basically made, you know, glue gun, candle wax, and some are based on sketches from anthropology museum exhibits. But they are meant to be relics for the relics of advanced capitalism, our legacy for future generations. So reminiscent of devotional artifacts and ceremonial figures, such as totems, votives, and Janus figures, they infer the overvalue of commodities and packaging and seem powerful. But they are not sacred objects that are preserved for centuries because they're culturally significant. They are waste products that can't be destroyed. Okay, and then moving swiftly on, this is a series called Host Figures, They Live, that was inspired by another kind of anthropology jaunt, but this time to the Met Museum in New York, and a Guatemalan figurine, a host figure, that had a removable chest plate that reveals a diminutive spirit figure who drives the actions and intentions of its host. And I was kind of looking at this object and thinking about the things that shape our thoughts and actions today. I'm particularly thinking about toys and sweets that influence behaviour from an early age. And some of you may have recognised the reference to John Carpenter's 1989 film, They Live, a dystopian cult film set in Los Angeles during a time of extreme social inequality, characterised by high unemployment and conspicuous consumption. In the film, special sunglasses enable the wearer to see the true messages of advertising, consume and obey. I've always viewed the film as an instruction that art should reveal things that are usually opaque or hidden from view. And so host figures are produced as lenticular prints. So these are the two images that combine into the single object that change as you walk around it. And hopefully reveal the commodity spirits and branding commands that influence our actions and beliefs. And finally, this is what I'm working on now, which is a painting series, the first I have done, despite lots of performance and sculptural work. This is a new one and actually very much a lockdown project. So people sent me broken and discarded phones and sometimes bits of phones. And I used them to paint images that I found when searching for hashtags to do with wellness, fitness, and health. And I'm quite interested in how our mobile phones become these kind of carriers of all sorts of important information, but also how we connect outwardly. And, you know, this is something we very much felt during lockdown, that kind of, it was a conduit to an outside world, but also potentially a real site of vulnerability. So I was having a look at these and painting them, and I am currently in the process of putting them back into the digital realm. So I literally just posted the first one today, so it is very new. And yeah, so I was quite interested in this idea of blurring the line between real and digital worlds, which is, of course, a very blurred line already. And by returning the images to Instagram, they inhabit the space as kind of quite archaic, functionless, disconnected objects, dodgy painted versions of bright, positive and aspirational images that appear to be heavy and lifeless in comparison to the lightness of their hashtag messages. So if you're interested in seeing how that project develops, please do feel free to follow the Instagram account that you see before you, and do ask me any questions, because I am done. Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you very much, Dawn. Now, questions. We've got a little bit of time for these. The way this is going to work is I'm going to give you all the opportunity to unmute yourselves, but I don't want you to just all rush in and do it. What I hope is that the Zoom participants will just identify themselves in the chat room, and then I would ask you to go on to speaker view, and then I would invite you to ask your question, and once you've done that, perhaps you would go back to mute and we'll move on to the next one. I can't see any questions as yet in the room, so I'm going to use the chairman's indulgence and ask the first one myself. Dawn, you made it very clear that there's a very strong academic background. You are an academic, you are an artist. Would you be an artist if you were not an academic?
Well, I think I'd say I was an artist first before I kind of knew what an academic was. But I guess I feel like I came quite late in life to really, like in my teens, to really understand that that art was a profession and academia was a profession. So yeah, maybe they are more joined than I think. I think I've always been a researcher, but then I think artists are researchers. It's like, in order to be able to really express quite succinct and complex messages visually or performatively, or whatever media you use, you need to actually have a pretty good understanding of that subject. So there's always a lot of work that goes underneath any work. But yeah, I think I do also. I've always been interested in the kind of theory side, like not only of the world kind of out there, but also how my images are likely to be received. And so like with the early work and the kind of more illusionistic stuff, it's like, just how do we look at things and what does that mean, and how can I play with that as an artist?
Thanks very much, Dawn. Now we've got a couple of questions now starting to come through. There's Paul Vining, but I can only see part of the question. So Paul, you better ask the question direct so we can hear what it is.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Paul.
All right, thanks very much. In some of the early images shown, the photographs appear to be collages. And I wondered if there was a creative or an aesthetic reason for this, or was it just practical? And did that have an effect at all on what you were trying to convey with those photographs?
Well, I mean, in some ways they're collaged, but they're collaged in the real world. So there are cutouts in them, but they are photographed. So the images themselves that you see are not collaged out of different parts. They are the thing that was in front of the camera when the shutter was released. But there is certainly a collaging of elements. So like the photographs of me that are cut out, were taken earlier, like days before, weeks before the actual photograph was taken. So in some ways there's a collage of different moments of time. And then in the images where I was kind of producing two-dimensional or three-dimensional sets out of two-dimensional images, they have the look and aesthetic of collage, but again, it's in the real world rather than on a page. And so yeah, and those aesthetics are very important to what I'm trying to say. They or not even the aesthetics, I think formally and structurally, they underpin the kind of the ideas that I'm trying to explore in that work.
Thank you.
Right. Next question is from Andrew, parenthesis, they, them, close bracket. So Andrew, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, yes. Hi. Hi, Dawn. Really interesting talk. You mentioned, I really enjoyed the Dutch still life stuff, but the question I have is, you mentioned an author who wrote about the contradiction of indulgent and self-restraint. I just wonder, I've been making notes and I didn't catch their name. Could you just confirm what their name was, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Robert Crawford, and he's a really amazing researcher and writer, particularly to do with ideas of health. So I'd heartily recommend getting a copy of his articles if you can.
Okay, that's great. And just for the record, I'm up in Derbyshire, so yes, I wouldn't have got to see this if we were all face to face. So thanks very much.
That's great. And also my next talk event this week is on Thursday at the University of Derby, but also from this seat and not actually in Derby. So
who are you speaking to there?
Well, there's a conference run by the university on digital painting and photography, which I think Frances Woodley is in the audience, who is also speaking at it. So
oh, cool.
So yeah, do have a look if you can. Certainly, I think their website is live.
I'll check it out. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Great, thank you very much. Sean, I think you have a question.
Yes, Dawn. Sorry, can you see me? Yes,
Yeah.
yes, Dawn, thank you. I just wondered, given what you were talking about, the effectiveness of photographic advertising, were there any commercial organizations or manufacturers have sought your advice on the effectiveness of their advertising?
No, although when I was showing my PhD work for my PhD Viva, the building or the gallery happened to be next to a building that had a lot of advertising companies in. And actually a couple of people did drop by and be like, oh, we're really interested in this work. And we into that, I was like, oh no, maybe I'm copying them too closely. And I'm now actually giving them ideas to how to, more effectively grab our attention, so it's I always feel a little bit conflicted about it. And also actually doing the work in commercial advertising spaces, it's like I know that I'm presenting something different than you would usually see in those spaces, but I'm also giving money to those spaces and making them more financially stable, not that they were having problems anyway, but yeah, so I'm supporting that industry by doing that work, so I always have a little bit of worry attached to that work as well, but yeah.
Okay, thanks Dawn. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Next question is from Paul Cabot. Paul, if you'd like to put your question.
Oh, hi. Hello, Dawn. Hi,
Paul. How are you?
Yeah, I should have here. I think Raymond Williams wrote famously about the magic bullet and the fact that this idea that if you just sort of reveal the mechanisms of commodification, then all of a sudden we all go aghast and say, what a horror, and tear it down. So I guess I'm wondering to what extent do you feel that you're trying to break the system as much as reveal the system?
That's a good question. And yeah, if only the magic bullet worked, right? Because we'd have all have done our jobs ages ago. But yeah, well, I think actually towards the end of my PhD, I'd kind of, and I felt I was rather good at pointing out all the problems, what's wrong and why it's wrong. But actually coming up with alternatives is a much harder job. So that's kind of what I've been trying to do since then. And certainly in terms of the work I'm doing with selfies, it's kind of looking at ways that they can be produced, because I don't think people should stop doing them. I think visibility is important and kind of a gift. But how can they be done in a way that doesn't reinforce these stereotypes and is potentially damaging, particularly to women? So yeah, it's more like offering alternatives and trying to find other ways that are less problematic. But yeah, I mean, the system is all encompassing and we need it too much, like even social media, which is a relatively new thing, has become so integrated into our lives and given us so much that it would be a terrible thing to lose it, I think, even though it's actually deeply problematic. And I mean, all of the Facebook revelations that have happened over the last month or so show just how damaging they are, but it's still not enough, I don't think, to say press the delete button. And I guess actually in a more standard advertising or more traditional advertising, at least there's a possibility of legislation and that kind of thing. And, over the last couple of years, stricter rules in terms of the display of gender stereotypes have come in the UK and things like that. So things can change, but advertisers are very clever people, and I think that's why I try and copy them, because they are visually very clever. They've got smart tricks, but they're always going to find new ways to be a bit, just to do their jobs well, which seems to require having quite stereotypical content and reinforce patriarchy and those kind of things. So yeah, or we could just have a clean sweep of advertisers and just like get rid of all the horrible ones and get some nice ones in. But I'm not sure how to make that happen yet.
Yeah, but it's still part of the system, which is the problem we all grapple with. But
yeah,
big subject. Thank you. Talk about it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Right, thank you very much, Paul. Right, the next question comes from the Salisburys, and before I put it, Dawn, I should warn you, if you don't know Alan Salisbury's work, referencing Dutch still life and the slaughterhouse is not an uncommon feature of it. Alan, or is it Jane, or which altogether? Would you like to put your question?
Okay. Well, we recall seeing Dawn's marvelous hanging flesh in Bay Art, and actually in the slide, Alan's paintings were adjacent to Dawn's hanging meat, so that was great. What we're saying is that, you know, Dawn's put her work very much in the public domain, in city centres, on big poster hoardings, and we wondered what sort of responses, if any, that she got. And did she do any focus group or follow-up work on audience response? That was where we were coming from. And then my thought as a social scientist was, is she trying to be like Vance Packard in The Hidden Persuaders, that classic stuff about advertisement? Is she on a mission to make people more able to make sense of the ways that ads commodify and promote consumption? So it's two questions really, but we really enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Dawn.
Yeah.
Thank you, and two great questions. I'll deal with the second one first, as it's freshest in my mind. And yeah, well, actually, visual literacy is something that I think about a lot, and maybe this actually kind of better answers Paul's question now that it's popped into my head. As a way that you can actually positively change things. And this is certainly true in terms of selfies and gestural language and things like that, but also I think in the ability to unpack what adverts are saying and maybe to make a more, I don't know if even informed decision is the right word, but because I think, you know, a lot of the time adverts sort of make us feel bad about ourselves. You know, there's a lot of focus on issues, problems, and imperfections that can be, you know, made better. And I think particularly as a female consumer, we are absolutely hounded from our teens onwards. So yes, certainly having some sort of visual literacy skills to debunk some of that stuff. And also maybe there's a kind of space for a feminist consciousness raising workshop type thing about, you know, sharing experiences of viewing these images and how they make us feel, because they're also very much aimed at the individual. So it's about you and your skin or whatever. So maybe actually opening that out and universalizing it again might be a way to buffer against some of the negative impacts of this material. And then in terms of your question about the kind of reception of the posters, I didn't really get a lot of feedback and I kind of didn't expect to. And perhaps focus groups could have worked, but because they were very much like on the street or, you know, next to a road, kind of finding the people who have happened upon them, if you like, and have something to say, I think would be quite tricky. So, and actually this is how I sort of justified it to the Arts Council, because obviously you need to tell them how you're going to monitor and evaluate your funded project, was that, well, I did kind of use social media and hashtags, which not to great effect, I have to say. But actually one of my successes was just the idea that a certain amount of people every day pass these things, and rather than selling them something, I've given them, if they look, I've given them a slightly different thing to think about. So there was a kind of like, that was my positive spin on what was essentially a total inability to monitor or evaluate the project.
Fair enough. Yeah.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I mean, we were wondering if you did tap into anything like that, because they are very powerful images throughout. And
I did get one piece of sort of a kind of feedback, which was the pacifier poster, which is the long thin one. someone had ripped one of the vignettes off. It was missing. So either they hated it or they loved it, and it was on someone's wall for a while, or I have no idea, but I felt like that was quite strong feedback.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, we've got time for one last question, and it's from Francis Woodley. So Francis.
Yeah, very quickly, really. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Hello. I'm making the presumption that your work is issue-led. I'm just thinking about what are your thoughts on the importance of using art in particular in the service of a critique of culture?
Well, in some ways, it's like my weapon of choice in that respect. And certainly, definitely, I'm an issue-led artist, but actually, I'm an activist. And I think my artistic practice is a kind of an avenue of that work. And I think the same as advertising in a way, artists can be very good at producing succinct messages about complex ideas that are kind of understandable to quite a wide audience because of the often visual nature of the material. So in some ways, I think it's really in a prime place to do some activist work and to convey issues in a way that, you know, verbal text things, I think, would lose an audience. I think you do get much more better engagement, actually. And I haven't spoken about this work, but I'm currently in the middle of a little project in collaboration with another artist where we're making adverts for Facebook that are kind of like animated optical illusions that debunk neoliberal economic policies, which they're simpler and more visually interesting than I made that sound. But actually, because they're sponsored posts on Facebook, we've been getting lots of comments and things, and people have quite heated arguments about whether, you know, the work is crap, whether neoliberalism is crap, you know, all sorts of things. So actually, suddenly we're like, wow, we're actually getting engagement and feedback in a way that I have not experienced before. And clearly the work is being viewed and it's inciting people to have quite strong emotional responses. So in that respect, it's, I found that actually it's doing what I want it to do, and in a really clear and, actually a monitored way. So, I don't know if that fully answered it, but
I think it's interesting that you call yourself an artist activist, and that's a conclusion we would draw from listening and hearing your work. I just wonder actually whether you shouldn't have said it earlier.
Oh, maybe it wouldn't occur to me like to state what I am at the beginning.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. I'm going to write that note into my paper. Thank you.
Okay. That's absolutely great. Thank you, everybody, for those very interesting questions. I think one can always tell the quality of the talk by the quality of the questions that flow from it. And to be honest, I'd never previously thought of Dutch masters as producing selfies, but I get it, and I'm going to start rethinking some of this. Now, in a moment, I'm going to ask everybody to say thank you to Dawn in the traditional manner. But before I do so, if anyone who's been participating in this would like to know more about CASW, including how to become a member, we need the money, please visit our website, which is casw.org.uk, and you'll get all the relevant information. I'd also like to mention our next speaker will be Jonathan Powell, and he will be talking to us on the 16th of November, again via Zoom and YouTube. So please look out for the details, which I'll be sending out in about a week or so. Right, let's now say thank you in the traditional way. If everybody switches to gallery view, puts on their speakers, puts on their cameras, claps, whistles, whatever it is that they wish to do. Let's all say thank you very much to Dawn.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Right, everybody. It's exactly 8:15, which is when we said that we would bring the talk to an end. Thank you all very much for taking part, and we'll see you, I hope, on the 16th of November. Good night.
Thank you, Rowan. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.